Hello, everyone. Thank you for tuning in to another JINSA webinar. I'm JINSA's Director of Foreign Policy, Jonathan Ruhe. Today's webinar is entitled Global Implications of the War in Israel, and it's the latest in an ongoing series of timely JINSA webinars providing regular updates on the ongoing conflict, as well as insights into some of the key aspects and broader potential consequences of the conflict. On this note, I'd like to remind everyone to also tune in to tomorrow's webinar at 10 a.m. Eastern on the U.S. military response to the war in Israel, featuring former CENTCOM Commander General Joe Votel and former Deputy CENTCOM Commander Admiral Mark Fox. Please also keep an eye out for the steady stream of JINSA briefs, op-eds, and other content providing daily updates on the conflict, as well as analyses and recommendations for American policymakers. And today, to discuss the ongoing war's broader global implications, I am privileged, as always, to be joined by General Phillip Breedlove and Ambassador Eric Edelman. General Breedlove is the former Supreme Allied Commander of NATO and a participant in JINSA's Generals and Admirals program. He is also a distinguished professor at the Sam Nunn School of International Affairs at Georgia Tech. Ambassador Edelman is a counselor here at JINSA's Gemunder Center and also at the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments here in DC, where here at JINSA, he co-chairs several policy projects, including on U.S. policy toward Iran and on the Eastern Mediterranean. He is also a former U.S. ambassador to Finland and to Turkey, and the former Undersecretary of Defense for Policy. For our audience, I'd just like to remind you, please type any questions you have for our panelists into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. We'll do our best to address them each in turn. We've got a lot to get to today. Ambassador Edelman, I'm going to start with you, and I'd like to ask you about the current war in the Middle East in the context of U.S. global force posture and our ability, as President Biden is fond of saying, walking and chewing gum at the same time. We've seen the U.S. move a significant amount of forces into the broader Middle East and East Med since this conflict began, all while we continue to support Ukraine. And so I'd just like to ask you, with a broad brush, how sustainable do you think these simultaneous efforts can be? What sort of concerns or thoughts do you have about our global force posture if the current conflict escalates in the Middle East?
Well, thank you, Jonathan. It's great to be with you this afternoon and with all the viewers tuning in. I do want to say that I am particularly pleased to be on this panel with General Phil Breedlove, who was my colleague in government when I was Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, was frequently my wingman in the Situation Room for meetings of the National Security Council Deputies Committee and sometimes Principals Committee. And he served with great distinction as the Supreme Allied Commander, as you noted, and he continues to provide a lot of terrific commentary on national security affairs and is a national treasure. So I'm glad to be here with him. I think what I would say about your question is that we've had two national defense strategies in a row. The 2018 Trump National Defense Strategy and then the 2022 Biden National Defense Strategy that have prioritized a rising China and a revanchist Russia as our biggest security threats and have both suggested, either explicitly or implicitly, that we should be willing to take risk in the Middle East to draw down our security commitments there and limit our liabilities there while we prioritize for these other theaters. And I think what we've seen since October 7th is, to paraphrase Trotsky, you may not be interested in the Middle East, but the Middle East is interested in you. And it's easy to say, in paper documents and in theory, that the United States is going to limit its liabilities in the Middle East, but we continue to have important interests in the Middle East that are threatened by a variety of actors in the region. And I think the perception of our departure from the region has actually contributed to some of the disorder that we see there. And I think that needs to be repaired. I do agree with President Biden that we are the United States of America, for God's sakes, and we can do more than one thing at a time. And I would submit that that's a question of of national will. It's a question of how much are we willing to literally tax ourselves to spend on the national defense. We are now facing, I think, arguably the most complex security environment, international security environment the United States has faced since the end of World War II, and arguably in its history. We have two emerging nuclear peers, a completely unique circumstance that was recognized recently, by the way, by the congressionally mandated Strategic Posture Commission of the United States, that was chartered to consider our nuclear forces and how we should think about them going forward into the future. We face continued challenges from proliferating nuclear states like North Korea, which is already a nuclear weapon state and developing all the appurtenances of a nuclear triad, and of course Iran, which remains an aspiring nuclear weapon state and frankly is kind of on the doorstep now of having a nuclear capability, which ought to be, particularly given the events since October 7th, ought to be sobering for everybody. So, this is a question of national will. We're spending as a matter of gross national product historically low amounts, compared to what we spent during the Cold War, when arguably the challenges were perhaps more dangerous, but certainly less complex than the ones that we face today. So, I think we're going to see a lot of rethinking coming out of these events about exactly how we ought to be postured. And I hope it leads to some significant increases in the Congress's appropriation of money for national defense and the Biden administration's budgeting for national defense, because we have to be able to do all of these things, at the same time.
Thank you, Ambassador. And sort of as a follow-on question that I'll pivot to General Breedlove. We heard Treasury Secretary Yellen say in the last 24 hours that, in not so many words, the United States can afford two wars at once, at least in terms of supporting Israel and then supporting Ukraine as they defend themselves. But I think, as Ambassador Edelman mentioned, this is partly a question of national will, and we've certainly heard issues about the capacity of America's defense industrial base to support not only our allies abroad, but also the US's own needs. And so far, we've seen the United States surge in material support to Israel, and then in addition to the support we've been providing Ukraine over the last year plus. And so I think, General Breedlove, it would be helpful if you could give us a sense of, do you worry that especially if we have to prolong our support for Israel, if this war doesn't indeed get worse, and we're in something like a sort of continued support for two countries, one in Europe, one in the Middle East, do you worry about this stretching our industrial base, defense industrial base too thin? Sort of how long can we keep this up?
So first of all, Jonathan, thanks for having me on. Let me return the kind compliments. It's a pleasure to be on with Ambassador Edelman. Much of what I learned about how our government really works from the inside, I learned from him. And may I just say, more importantly even than that, I learned an awful lot about what civilian control of the military really looks like at the level of execution. And it was my pleasure, as he mentioned, to sit off his right wing many a time as we went over as a civil military team to do our nation's business. So it's really great to be on with the ambassador this morning. Well, your question is prescient, and it's very important because we are even now stretched as far as the ability of our industrial base to support what we really need to do. And just not to reach too far back in history, but we have to remember that the position we find ourselves in is because in the past, right, wrong, or indifferent, some people did some things that were untoward and maybe made more money than they should or took advantage of the situation. And our nation responded, as it has in many cases, with laws and regulations that sort of tailor, adapt, and control the way that industry responds to military requirements. And in fact, for a long period of our time, if an industrial prime contractor were to build excess capacity on the dollars of existing contracts, that would come under great scrutiny, if not penalty, for their future. And so we are very much now building constrained to the budgets that we are given. And our capacities are controlled and constrained by the budgets that we are given. And so that is very good for oversight of the industrial base, but it is not a good situation to find yourself in when the nation needs the industrial base to stretch and to create excess or new capacities. An example that I know of for sure, one of the missiles that were being used extensively in the beginning of this war and still are being extensively used, when the government reached out to the prime and said, we want you to double your production. The prime went away, did its homework, and said, outstanding, first deliveries in the calendar first quarter of 28. Now think about that. How's that going to help today's fight? What we know is that the primes actually have some ability to rapidly expand their part of the build and construction of weapons, but all the primes rely on a multitude of subprimes and smaller contractors who bring important parts to the business. And they have zero ability to expand quickly, because in a mom and pop operation with, say, 100 or 125 people, if you start risking the money to build excess capacity, that means somebody doesn't get fed, somebody doesn't get to go to school, somebody can't buy a car, whatever you want to talk about. And so it is that family of subprimes and smaller contractors that are severely constrained in their ability to rapidly expand to requirement. And so I would just say, not talking on behalf of the primes, but on behalf of our system and our nation, which needs an ability to rapidly react. We need to understand better how to regulate, but also incentivize the ability for primes to have excess capacity, because we are not in that situation right now. We are still, and my professor here will grade my paper, but we are still living a little bit in the building of the Reagan years and things. And we are very much about to run out of that excess that was created back then. And before we do, we need to have this figured out.
So,
Jonathan, can I just
yes, please.
I just want to agree heartily with everything that Phil said, but maybe add a couple of observations. So historically, when you look back after the Cold War ended in the 90s, we took a peace dividend and we cut defense budgets, even as we increased the operational tempo of the military by engaging in a number of overseas operations in Somalia, in Haiti, in the Balkans, etc. And so the defense industry shrank as a result. And, you don't spend the money, you put people out of business. So we have fewer companies involved in defense industry, to begin with. Then starting with the wars of the post 9/11 era, the wars of the wars against terror, we ended up, replenishing some items essentially through either supplemental appropriations or what we came to call, overseas contingency operations, and funded them kind of very irregularly. And so the defense industry got very used to getting big orders for stuff, for a couple of years, and then it would drop off. And so to Phil's point, industry needs to basically do two things because of the shrinkage of the defense industrial base, which is to build out more floor space to be able to build various items. I mean, right now, if you ask industry to go, and I'll just use two examples, and they're not great examples because in one instance the production line's actually closed for Stinger. But if you say I need more Javelins, which is an anti-tank guided missile, or I need more Stingers, which is a shoulder-fired anti-air missile, both of which have been consumed in enormous quantities in the fight in Ukraine. If you go to industry and say, I need more of both, they're going to say, well, which one do you want first? Because there's limited floor space, and production of munitions is actually not, this is not like Henry Ford cranking out Model Ts. There's a certain artisanal component to some of these systems, and you need a highly trained workforce. So it's a combination of floor space, but if you talk to folks in industry, they'll tell you the big long pole in the tent is highly qualified workforce and hiring those folks. Yeah. And that is going to require, a significant investment and a change, to Phil's point, in the way that we do business in the Department of Defense. So the department has been pushing the Congress over the last 2 years because of Ukraine to provide them, with multi-year authority for procurement of munitions, which we have historically, by the way, shorted. When we've settled our accounts at the end of each fiscal year around September 30th, we've always taken money out of the munitions accounts on the argument that, well, we'll get whole next year, and we'll up the buy next year, which we never do. And so we almost ran out of precision guided munitions in 2015 during the counter ISIL fight. The U.S. Air Force almost ran out. So we need to give the Department of Defense more authority, but moreover, we need to actually appropriate dollars against those authorities. So Congress, in fact, gave the department some authorities for multi-year buys and for being able to buy items with the knowledge that our partners are going to be buying them, and so we don't have to actually appropriate the money or authorize the money for all of the buy, but we've got to appropriate the dollars to start the buy, and Congress has not done that. And we need to do that so that we can become the arsenal of democracy that I think we need to be. You quoted Secretary Yellen saying we can afford 2 wars at once. Let's be clear. We're not fighting 2 wars ourselves right now. We are supporting partners and allies in fighting a war, and we can do that. If we had to fight 2 wars ourselves right now, we're not in a position to do that. That's going to require significant additional investment, in part because our national defense strategy, both last go round and this one, has sized our force to fight 1 war and deter conflict in the others. And I don't think that's sufficient for the future that we face.
So Ambassador Edelman, I'd just like to tag on a follow-on question to that, because as we've seen with the Ukraine conflict, things that, as you mentioned, Ukraine is using up at incredible rates, like artillery and anti-tank munitions, certainly strained our defense industrial capacity. And in the context of the Middle East conflict that's ongoing, we've seen Israel have a high need for resupply of air defense interceptors that are co-produced with the United States, and then also U.S.-made precision-guided munitions. And well before October 7th, this was an issue that we'd continually heard was, another sort of choke point for the United States. And given what could be a high-intensity conflict in the Middle East now, are you concerned about the U.S. ability, I guess more specifically, to continue to resupply interceptors and or precision guided munitions? Are they 2 more examples of this more profound problem that you and the general have laid out?
Well, I mean, I think right now, and Phil will correct me if I'm wrong on this, but the overlap between what our Israeli colleagues need, which is basically Tamir interceptors for the Iron Dome system and small diameter bombs for precision strikes in Gaza, are not things that we have been providing to Ukraine. So the Venn diagram overlap, it's sort of right now a null set. Mm-hmm. But as you say, if we begin to get into a longer conflict in the Middle East, that could change. You mentioned artillery. Obviously one of the big items in the Ukraine context has been 155 rounds. And Bill LaPlante, the Undersecretary for Acquisition, has been working tirelessly to increase our ability to produce that. But the Ukrainians are using firing 6,000 rounds a day. And our production capacity right now is something in the 20 to 40,000 a month range. By the end of this year, we hope to get it higher. But it's only going to be the end of fiscal 24, the fourth quarter of fiscal 24, that we get to the 80,000 a month range. And then sometime in fiscal year 25, 100,000 a month. So, given the volumes of fire, we're going to start running into problems down the road, particularly if this war in the Middle East expands and gets bigger.
So thank you for that. And General Breedlove, I'll jump back to you with sort of a different follow-on question and maybe try to sweep up a couple of our audience Q&A in the process. So given your experience as NATO Supreme Allied Commander, and I've heard you mention the defense industrial base issues well before even the Ukraine conflict started, given what you and Ambassador Edelman have laid out as this both deep and long-term problem that with our capacity that's not going to be resolved anytime soon, how much confidence or what have you seen so far in terms of at least our European allies to help fill some of those stopgaps? Are they a helpful short-term solution as before we get our own house in order, or are they facing sort of the same systemic problems that we are?
We're all facing the same problems, but they also are a part of the solution. We're beginning to see some of the nations gin up in some of these capabilities and capacities. And I must say, thankfully, too, that the last set of reports I saw, which are about a week old, are that now Europe is giving about half of what we're giving to Ukraine. So Europe has stepped up to the plate and is answering up to about half of the supply. And the last list I saw, if you go on a per GDP basis, the United States is actually down around 12th or 13th in giving, that there are 12 nations at least, maybe more now, that are giving more on a per GDP basis than America. So I don't want to pump sunshine here, but I do believe that in respect to our European brothers and sisters stepping up to the task, it's getting better every day. It's not where it needs to be, and we still need a little more leadership out of some of the big top leaders, but it's headed in the right direction, and that's a very good thing. But may I go back to your original question and say that none of us really are doing what we would need to do if we think we're going to have sustained conflict. The ambassador nailed it with a couple of things that I'll just regurgitate a little bit. Multi-year contracting. And as I mentioned before, we have to rethink how we incentivize industry. There is no incentive to a prime to build excess capacity. In fact, as I said before, a prime faces legal battles if they're building excess capacity off of existing contracts. And so we've got to rethink that, because we don't really have a shock absorber here. If the world says ready, set, go, we're a couple of years away from go. Okay, and that's what we've got to think our way through. And the good news, as you mentioned, is right now the two conflicts that are going on are drawing sort of very different requirements. And I don't mean this in a criticism or condescending way, but a more basic crunching warfare going on in Ukraine, and a little bit more high tech going on in Israel. And so the draw hasn't been a big competition, but it will become that if this draws out over time.
So I would just, before we move on to the next line of questions, on this issue of U.S. defense industrial base and how to support Ukraine and Israel simultaneously, I would just note that our CEO, Mike Makowski, and our VP for Policy, Blaise Michelstahl, had a Wall Street Journal op-ed early this year on the issue of the U.S. pulling 155 millimeter shells out of our pre-positioned stockpile in Israel and moving them to support Ukraine, and then the implications and opportunities that creates for U.S. support for Israel, which has been a longstanding JINSA issue. I'd like to sort of pivot now to perhaps a different overlap or interplay between what we're seeing in the Middle East and what we've been seeing in Ukraine. So, General, I'll start with you first. We saw, maybe this is anecdotal, I'd like you to comment. We saw a video of during Hamas's assault on October 7th of using drone dropped munitions on Israeli armor and other units, which certainly seems to have a parallel to what we've seen in a lot of the fighting in Ukraine. And then also, obviously, Iranian-made drones are increasingly a feature of the conflict in Ukraine. Sort of using those as sort of a way to tee you up, I guess. Have you noticed, how do you assess any interplay between on the tactical and operational levels between what we've seen in Ukraine and what we've seen in the Middle East? Are the two theaters learning from each other? And then as a follow-on, given what's happening in the Middle East, does that create operational opportunities for Russia in Ukraine?
So, wow, there were really a couple of questions there. Let me just reach out and say that we need to give a lot of respect to what the Ukrainian military has done in adapting these new technologies to the battlefield. And sadly, some of that's happened because we in the West have been so slow, so creepingly slow in giving them the things that they need of a more high-tech capability. And so you have literally this drone army, and they got some specialized units, some drone ninjas in there that are using these small, almost over-the-counter type drones to do exquisite work against armor in the field. The Russians are getting a little smarter after losing dozens, if not hundreds of tanks to munitions being dropped through open hatches on the top of tanks. They're starting to learn. And we're all learning that we, and I put the United States in that we are not ready to defend against this kind of attack. We have some exquisite weapons, but they are very few and far between, and they are not widespread, and neither are they wide area. They are very localized type defense options. And so our military and Israel's military are learning from what they've seen Ukraine do to Russian armor, and to a certain degree because they were surprised what Hamas did to Israel on that first day of battle. And I'm going to be shameless here. Okay, I'm going to be shameless. It also is a crisp reminder of what happens when you do not own the skies over your forces. The United States military and coalition militaries who have served with it have enjoyed at least battlefield air superiority since the spring of '53 in the Korean War. We train people to fight accepting and expecting at least battlefield air superiority. We have not given that battlefield air superiority to the Ukrainians, and we see the troubles they have. And we saw the troubles the first day of the fight when Hamas attacked into Israel. And I think you see those kinds of problems going down now because Israel is at the ready, and they have established air supremacy at this point, but at least air superiority over all of the Gaza Strip. And now that makes a big difference. So my shameless plea is we need to remember a few of the first tenets of a battle, and that is we, the Air Forces, not the U.S. Air Force, but we, the Air Forces of the Western and free world, owe to our soldiers, sailors, airmen and Marines and guardians air superiority overhead them so that we can fight the high-tech kind of fight that we want to fight and take it to the enemy the way that we want to take it to the enemy.
Thank you, General, and for addressing the handful of questions I threw at you at once there. So Ambassador Edelman, I'd like to sort of take this line of questioning to the more strategic and diplomatic level. And And speaking of shameless, we've seen Vladimir Putin comment on the war breaking out thus far, and comparing what Israel is doing to the siege in World War II of his hometown of Leningrad. I'm curious. And then on the other hand, we've seen Zelensky and the Ukrainian government proactively giving an outpouring of support for Israel. I guess from Putin's perspective, what's the play here in terms of seemingly, and please poke holes in this if merited, seemingly, sort of doubling down on his ties with Iran and then indirectly with Iran's proxy network?
Well, I think the Russians for some time have been trying to engage in a very careful balancing act, maintaining the rather good relations that President Putin has cultivated with Israel over the years, and particularly with Prime Minister Netanyahu. I believe it's still the case that Prime Minister Netanyahu has made more trips to Moscow than he has to Washington, in the last few years. But I think the combination of the unusually strong, robust Western response to his invasion of Ukraine, which I think took him by surprise, as well as the strong Western support for Israel after October 7th, which I think may also have taken him a bit by surprise, has made it harder for him to engage in this kind of balancing act, particularly because he's so dependent on Iran for instance, drone manufacture, which he's been using in Ukraine. And so I think you see kind of, I think he's just sort of reverting really to type here. And I do think it's unfortunate that Prime Minister Netanyahu turned down President Zelensky's offer to visit Israel to show solidarity from the part of Ukraine with what's happened in Israel. Because when you think about it, both Israel and Ukraine have been subject to very similar kind of assault by an adversary, in both cases, that wants to eliminate the countries. I mean, President Putin has made no bones about the fact that he wants to essentially eliminate Ukraine as a functioning, livable country. The assault on Ukrainian civilians in Bucha and Irpin is in many ways very reminiscent of a lot of what we saw happening with the Hamas assaults on the towns it overran in southern Israel. Very similar kind of barbaric approach to warfare. So I think President Putin's not going to be able to really walk that line very well. And I hope Israelis draw the appropriate lessons from this experience. He's basically made it clear that in the end of the day, Russia is going to be on the side of Hamas and its patrons.
Thank you. And General Breedlove, to sort of just jump back to you, sort of keep pulling on this thread on different levels. You spoke about certainly the role of Iranian-made weaponry and that Russia is using in Ukraine, and I think perhaps, at least maybe for our audiences or more generally, there's an underappreciation of the flip side of that, which is the potential for growing Russian military support to Iran in terms of advanced fighters or air defenses or things like that. Do you have thoughts on do you have a high level of concern about that? We've heard reports, but we haven't seen anything yet. Do you, to what degree of alarm do you view those reports, and might sort of, as Ambassador Edelman mentioned, the tightening of Russia's connection with Iran on a strategic diplomatic level here, might that feed into their security partnership as well?
So it's kind of a yes and no question. I'm going to talk out both sides of my mouth. I agree with the ambassador. There's a big concern here that as we know, Russia is trying to pull together all of those people who have umbrage in the grand scheme of things with America and elements of the West, and trying to build that sort of network. I would say that some of it is loose and a little bit more for show, and some of it is more serious. And I do believe that what I worry about is Russia doing those things a little bit more below the line that provide sustenance, support, money maybe, and other things that help Iran move forward. I think it would be a big leap. I'm not saying an impossible leap, but it would be a bigger leap for Russian hardware to truly start showing up on the battlefield, S-300s, S-400s, et cetera, et cetera. I really believe that is not currently sort of in my concern. But below that, and some of the other things, and weapons and explosives and special kinds of things that could be used by Hezbollah and or Hamas in a way that would be a little less pointing at Russia. I absolutely do have a concern about that sort of thing beginning to happen. And just to close, I would say that, again, I believe that Mr. Putin finds purchase in bringing together all of those people who have take umbrage with us in a policy sense around the world and trying to build this network. I do not believe that it is terribly operational right now, but it is something that we have to respect for the future.
Thank you. So I want to get on to, in the time we have left, some of the other key actors around the world, but given some of the questions we've gotten from our audience, I think it sort of behooves us first to come back to an issue that we touched on a little earlier, which is sort of U.S. deterrence, because, as we like to say, deterrence is fungible, and what you promise to do in one place at one time translates to what you might do or not do at other places at other times. Ambassador Edelman, I'll start with you on this question. And we've certainly seen the U.S. move a lot of forces into the East Med and broader Middle East, but it seems that there's the question here of, as we point out on previous JINSA webinars, that the U.S. has sort of accumulated a deterrence deficit against the Iranians through nuclear negotiations and any other number of actions or non-actions. This may be a leading question, but to what extent is deterrence restored with several 100,000 tons of U.S. diplomacy in the form of carrier strike groups? What do you think the prospects are that might actually help diffuse some of the escalation or broadening of this war in the Middle East, and what knock-on effects might that have for the way we deal with other adversaries?
Well, deterrence is always, Jonathan, a combination of capability and perception of will by the adversary to use that capability. Sending 2 carrier strike groups to the Eastern Med is no joke, and the capability that represents is a serious one, and I certainly would hope it would give the Supreme Leader and President Raisi in Iran pause before they decide that they want to escalate this conflict and get into it themselves with Hezbollah and with their other Shia militias in Syria, as well as their other proxies around the region. And I think the president's strong statements of support for Israel, and now his visit there on Wednesday in solidarity with the Israelis, is another strong sign of the U.S. Being serious about this. But you're right, we've also done a lot through both the Trump and the Biden administrations to suggest we might not, when push comes to shove, have the will, to actually pull the trigger on some of these military assets if things go south in the region. So I'm hoping that the combination of rhetoric and physical presence of the President of the United States in the region and 2 carrier strike groups does make Iran think twice. I mean, I do think the Iranians have a lot to consider here. I mean, they can certainly make life quite miserable for Israel if Hezbollah gets into this with its arsenal of 150,000 rockets and missiles that have been built up over a number of years. But I don't think they've forgotten that they paid an enormous price back in 2006 when Israel went in. Even after the ground operations got off to a not terribly successful start, Israel ultimately imposed enormous costs on Hezbollah. It took Hezbollah a number of years to recover. And in the end of the day, for the mullahs in Tehran, Hezbollah is one of their main deterrents against us, particularly taking action against their nuclear program and against Israel, for that matter. Whether they want to, move that pawn and then see it taken off the board as a result of this, it's hard for me to judge. But I would hope that we're successful in restoring our deterrence a bit.
General Breedlove, did you have an addition?
Well, no, I want to violently agree with that to begin with. But what I would say is, and I've said this many times, I think it's even more evident now. People often ask me about how these other places in the world, how they're being affected by what's going on in Ukraine. And here's the way I answer. It's a bit sort of fighter pilotish, but it is this. Our policy, China, Taiwan, our policy, North Korea, South Korea, North Korea nukes, our policy, Iran, Israel, is all being written in Ukraine right now. The world is watching what is happening in Ukraine right now. And just like your parents told you, and my parents told me, don't listen to what a person says, watch what they do. The world is watching how we respond to unmitigated evil in Ukraine right now. And now we're seeing unmitigated evil in Israel. And so we need to understand that what we do in Ukraine counts. And I will say it even more fighter pilot-ish than the ambassador did. 2 aircraft carriers, battle groups with all the attendant firepower. That's a lot of capability. But capability doesn't add up to much unless you have policy and intent that others believe. When we have capability plus policy and intent that people believe, now you have real capability in the field.
Ambassador Edelman, is there something you wanted to add to that?
Well, the only thing I would add to what Phil said, which I agreed with everything, is that Secretary of Defense James Forrestal, the first Secretary of Defense, told Secretary of State George Marshall in 1947 that Russia's biggest export was chaos and disorder, and I think that remains the case today. And I think it's also the case for Iran. Both Iran and Russia benefit from, creating disorder. And when we talk about, this abstraction of the rules-based international order that the United States established after World War II, what we're now seeing is not the abstraction, but the reality of what happens when you don't have a rules-based order. You get the kind of barbarism that we've seen in Ukraine, and that we saw, sadly, over the last week in the south of Israel. So it's an abstraction most of the time, but there are times in the world where it becomes a reality. And I agree completely with Phil. We have to draw the line here in these places, because there are other places where we will find ourselves, in grief if we don't.
Thank you for that. I want to be sure to get to the China issue before we close out today. But before we jump to that, General Breedlove, we've seen since October 7th a combination of what I would say is fairly full-throated European support for Israel, but the Europeans also have a lot of equities in the Palestinian Authority, and then also sort of a long history of I would say mixed relations with Iran, including being subjected to Iranian and Hezbollah terrorism over the years. Add on top of that, obviously now the focus on Ukraine. Are there things realistically that you envision America's European NATO allies being able to do to help Israel or to deal with the potential for escalation in the Middle East at this point? Or do they just have their hands too full with Ukraine?
No, they can do more too. I mean, big nations like Germany, France, UK, and others, these are very important voices, and they are also very important suppliers of things that a fellow like-minded government like Israel would need. And so this is an important thing. And I think the voices we need to remember how powerful this is. I've said a couple of times on the news in the last few days that, I don't think that Hamas has any idea that they can militarily win what's about to happen. But I believe in that they do, in their heart of hearts, believe they can win the PR effort that's about to happen. And that's the real war they want to fight now. They want to get hostages killed. They want to get Palestinians killed. They want mayhem and ugliness to try to change world opinion about Israel, because the only way Hamas can win at this point is separating Israel from those who stand by her. And so I think that that's the fight that we're going to have to think about in these terms into the future.
And I would thank you for that comment. I would just point our audience to JINSA's Gaza Assessment Policy Project and our Hybrid Warfare Task Force, which have done great work over the years in laying out particularly this PR issue and how to deal with it that General Breedlove raised. So in the sort of waning minutes we have left, I want to try to shoehorn in two topics. I'll start with you, Ambassador Edelman. Just as we saw Russia, sort of seeming to declare sides diplomatically since the conflict started, we've also seen China, I think, sort of try to tack toward Iran, or at least take an anti-U.S. approach to this. And one of Iran's goals, I think it's fair to say, in sort of giving Hezbollah or granting Hamas, or certainly the Hamas attack seems to serve Iran's goals of trying to disrupt Saudi normalization with Israel, which we've heard the Biden administration and others say in not so many words would have a lot of benefits for the region, including reasserting U.S. leadership and sort of muscling China out of the region a little bit. I guess, how do you explain what you've seen from China thus far as a reaction? And to what extent are you worried about Iran succeeding in its goal of disrupting normalization? Oh, sorry, you're muted, Ambassador.
It's true, but I haven't said anything yet anyway. So you didn't miss anything. Look, the Chinese are also, I think, trying to walk a fine line. I mean, they didn't say anything at all publicly about Hamas until they were actually shamed into it by Senator Schumer, who just happened to be visiting in China when all of this happened. But China's interest, like Russia's and Iran's, is to try and disrupt and repurpose the global order in ways that benefit China's efforts to make itself the leading power in the world. And this is, there's nothing secret about this. These are things that Xi Jinping has set out as his ambitions for the country by 2049, which would be the centenary of the Chinese Communist Party revolution in the People's Republic. I think that I think they believe the situation holds promise for them because they can, to General Breedlove's point, turn the so-called global South against the United States through, the information operations, not just of Hamas, but it'll be Hamas's information operations amplified by both Russian and Chinese information operations as well. And I think they see this as an opportunity for them, to change the subject from other things and to focus, on that. look, there's no doubt that Iran was worried about the potential of Saudi Israeli normalization and the deal that the Biden administration was working on. I think, in Jonathan, as you know, I have been somewhat skeptical that the Biden administration could pull this off for a variety of reasons, because it's a very complicated diplomatic accomplishment that they were seeking to achieve, and the amount of time they had was actually very small before the election season would start to get in the way. I do think, for all intents and purposes, that normalization is on ice for a while. I mean, I'm just basing that on the public statements by the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and the results of Secretary Blinken's meeting with Mohammed bin Salman, the Crown Prince. So I think, I don't think that that's a permanent condition. I think, once, we see the outcome of this current round between Israel and Hamas, particularly if Israel is successful in, destroying Hamas's military capabilities and decapitating its leadership, which is, I think, what the objective of their operation is going to be, and crippling its ability to actually rule in Gaza. I think then there will be some opportunities, to get back to the normalization table, because the reality is, none of the Arab leaders really care about the Gazans or the Palestinians. They're more tools to be manipulated than they are human beings, to be protected. So, and you can see that, by the way, from the fact that the Egyptians refuse to take any, they won't even let them in, to the country temporarily for safe haven. So I think there'll be opportunities after this conflict is completed, to get back to some of the other diplomatic activities and normalization. But that's going to be a ways off, I think.
So I think with the few minutes we have left, I'd be remiss if I didn't ask a former U.S. ambassador to Turkey and a former NATO Supreme Allied Commander about Erdogan and Ankara's next moves. And so I'll quote directly from a question from our audience. I guess, General Breedlove, I'll pose it to you first, and then to Ambassador Edelman to close out. To what extent do Turkey and Qatar have leverage with Hamas? And how much can the U.S. exert influence on them, meaning Turkey and Qatar? So, General, I'll start with you for that last question.
Okay, we really should defer to the ambassador, but let me take the first swing. I'll set the stage for his real answer, and that is, both of these countries are important to what we want to do in the Middle East. I mean, Turkey is one of our most important allies, geostrategically and locational issues. This is an important country to NATO. And just watching what's going on in the Black Sea, which through the Montreux Convention is controlled completely by Turkey, we need Turkey, as they say in the football or soccer world, to be on side. And so the investment in trying to use these two nations who do have leverage to get to the right place, this is an important investment. And I'll leave the real wisdom to Ambassador Edelman to close out.
Well, I certainly agree with Phil that Turkey is a crucial player here, and an important member of our alliance. Although I would say it's a very wayward member of our alliance. And I know Phil had his challenges when he was SACEUR dealing with them, as I'm sure General Cavoli has now. Look, Turkey and I mean, there are several countries that have some influence with Hamas. Qatar is one of them. Iran, obviously. Russia, because Russia has relations with Hamas, and Turkey has cultivated, a relationship with Hamas. The oddity about that, of course, is, Turkey is, as General Breedlove was saying, a member of the NATO alliance, which is meant to be an alliance of values. And, why Turkey has cultivated this alliance with Hamas and with Qatar, for that matter, it is an indication that it is, to use General Breedlove's metaphor, not always on side, with the rest of the NATO alliance. They're not the only ones, by the way. I note that Prime Minister Orban was just meeting with President Putin, despite the fact that Putin is wanted by the ICC for the war crimes that have been committed in Ukraine. So it's going to take a lot, frankly, of a massaging. I mean, we're stuck with Erdogan for the foreseeable future. I think the most recent election, which was a disappointment to those of us who I think hoped for a different kind of future for Turkey. But he's there. I don't think he's going anywhere. I think we're going to have to deal with him for the foreseeable future. But that's going to take a lot of dexterity and skill, and unfortunately, we've got to treat everything as a transaction with Turkey. There's not. I don't think we can appeal to Turkey and say, please use your influence with Hamas, for the benefit of humanity, or for all of us in the West who are trying to, keep this conflict from expanding and et cetera, and clip Hamas's wings. I mean, he actually sympathizes with Hamas and has said so publicly. So I think we've got a lot of irons in the fire with Turkey, not just here, but in the Caucasus, in the Black Sea, as General Breedlove was saying, because of the Montreux Convention, in the Aegean, because of the relationship with Greece, which after years of being an unreliable NATO partner has actually become a much more reliable NATO partner, and we have to make that adjustment. So it's going to take quite a bit of deft diplomacy by the United States, but also understanding that we can't rely on Turkey as an ally and appeal to them on the basis of alliance solidarity. We're going to have to give them things that they're going to want, and we're going to have to demand things from them in return.
I think that's an appropriately weighty and complex answer to go out on for this hour. I'd like to thank the panelists, Ambassador Edelman and General Breedlove, for drinking from the fire hose, so to speak, as we sort of covered as much as we possibly could in 60 minutes. And thank you, as always, to our audience for tuning in for yet another JINSA webinar. And to remind everyone to tune back in tomorrow at 10 a.m. Eastern for a webinar on the U.S. military response to the war in Israel. So thank you again to my panelists and all of you for joining, and we look forward to seeing you again. Thank you.